The main reason is, at least the way that is in most other places, you're just working on soft money, which means as long as you've got grants that cover 100% of your salary, you get paid.
Oh, I can see why people wouldn't want to always.
Guaranteed.
Yeah.
So you have to be really good at securing grants, or have a lot of colleagues that are willing to put you on their grants.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a riskier kind of position.
Yeah.
But it's more streamlined, because you do little to no service and no teaching. I mean, there's no teaching expectation.
Yeah.
Usually in terms of service, usually you serve on dissertation committees, but you don't have to chair committees like in the department and around campus. So, a lot of research track faculty, their service, broadly speaking, or generally speaking, would be on committees, like dissertation committees, or service to professional organizations, like, where there's the president of HLTH, or
that counts.
They're the chair of some subcommittee or subsection or caucus within HLTH, for instance. But that's really more for professional networking than it is for service, even though it still gets filed under service. Yeah. So we talk about a three-legged stool for faculty members: teaching, service, and research. And you're evaluated under all three areas. In terms of tenure and promotion, the most difficult one to do very well in is research, generally speaking. You have to do, this is being recorded, but it's the truth. You have to do, good enough in the classroom, to be honest. And as little service as you can get away with to give you more time for your research. So, my issue personally is that I'm not a big PI kind of person. So, I'm not the guy that's going out and getting $1 million grants, but I'm a fantastic co-investigator. I think I'm a decent instructor. Hope y'all feel the same way. And I'm really, really good at service. That's where I stand out. Whether it's on a committee, like a dissertation committee, or whether it's chairing or participating on, business activities like curriculum and so on and so forth. But everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. I mean, we've had faculty who are fantastic researchers, but not that great in the classroom, and really stink when it comes to service. Like, you don't want them to chair it. And again, this is being recorded, but I'm not naming names. But that's true everywhere. It's not just our department.
Yeah.
People have different strengths.
Yeah, makes sense.
It's just, when it comes to your own promotion and tenure, you just have to work a little harder in certain areas that are not your strong points. If your strong point is research, I mean, I think it's not that hard to put in a little bit of effort to be a decent instructor. And it's really not that hard doing administrative stuff, but you just got to be detail oriented. And you have to be very timely about things. And not everybody's good at those things. So that's kind of where their strengths in those areas fall through. But that's not what class is about today. Maria, can you hear us okay?
Yep, I can hear y'all fine.
Gordon, can you hear us?
Yep.
Okay. Let's get our slide up here. So this is the last in-person lecture.
Are you as excited as we are?
To be wrapped up. I'm kind of glad the semester's come to an end.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, that's kind of a always do that, right? We can start anticipating, you know, the next thing you're doing.
Yeah.
So. All right, so you should be able to see my slides. Yeah, okay, thank you. And I'm gonna see if I can adjust the light in here a little bit. I'm gonna bring this up here. Probably one of those.
Oh,
Ah,
wow.
there we go.
Like,
A little better?
yeah,
Okay. It's not too dark for y'all, is it?
no.
That's great.
Feels like a movie theater.
Susan and Jordan, does that change how things look for you or not?
No, it's fine, and I can see your screen.
Okay, good. All right, so today we're going to talk about poverty and health, and we're going to talk about race and health. So it's like a 2-for-1 combo here. So I'm going to go through several terms that are related to wealth, particularly not having wealth. And the terms are overlapping or related to one another in some ways, but these terms are uniquely are used for unique purposes. That's the way to say it. So the first is poverty, which is a term that all of us should be familiar with. But the standard definition of poverty is the state or condition of having little or no money, goods, or means of support. And social scientists, especially sociologists, are interested in poverty in terms of how poverty is related to culture, the broader culture that you're discussing poverty in, power structures within that culture or society, and those sorts of things. So it's really more about what causes poverty. In public health, we're not as concerned about what causes poverty, although some of our interventions are designed to improve conditions, afford resources, et cetera, that would not normally be available because of poverty status. So when you think back to a couple of weeks ago when we talked about neighborhoods and housing, and we were looking at housing vouchers and that sort of thing, that would be an example of an intervention that provides resources that would help someone who is at or below the poverty line. What we're more concerned with in public health is what are the diseases and conditions that are related to poverty or that coexist with poverty or that are strongly associated with poverty, to use several different ways of saying that. And in particular, Poverty and some of the other terms we'll talk about today are very often found in the circles of social epidemiology work. And we've talked a little bit about social epidemiology along the way. At the very end of the lecture today, I've got a really cool data presentation that was a TED Talk years ago, but it's still really, really good. And it's basically social epidemiology in action. And it's the guys really like it. So continuing with poverty, we've got absolute poverty and we have relative poverty. So absolute poverty really has to do with not having basic necessities. This is kind of a universal idea or conceptualization of poverty, if you will. So not being able to meet basic needs, not having food, not having shelter, not having clothing, these sorts of things. So that is absolute poverty. Relative poverty, anytime you use the term relative, it means you're comparing one thing to another or one thing to many others, right? So relative poverty is a term that is used when you're talking about, let's say, a person's financial status or social status relative to others in the society around them. So absolute and relative are two specific, trunks of the tree, if you will, when we talk about poverty. So a little bit more about those. Absolute poverty, other names you'll see for it in the literature: extreme poverty and abject poverty. I know I've seen and read the term and heard the term abject poverty many, many times. I haven't heard extreme poverty as much, but these all basically mean the same thing. So here we're talking about a severe deprivation of basic human needs. And again, food, water, shelter, clothing, those sorts of things. And back in the early 90s, this idea was a dollar amount per day as an indicator of where the poverty line is. That was first introduced back right about the time I was getting ready to go to high school. And early on, the World Bank defined the new international poverty line. So this was an update from 1990 as $1.25 a day in 2008. In 2015, they bumped it up to $1.90, and the most recent update on that from 2022 is $2.15 per day. So that is that's a really low bar, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, that is not very much money.
It's an income.
Yes.
Income.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's pretty.
Yes, it's really bad.
I don't see how they could actually come up with that. Say
That would be standard across all countries and relative to all countries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because some of those you couldn't even get a drink.
Yeah.
In the US or Europe, you couldn't get anything
Exactly.
for that.
Yeah.
So I don't see how you can come up with an international one like that unless it was the average of everybody.
And that is a really good point you bring up, because what that means then is that this measure may or may not be useful for what it is you're studying, depending on what your specific research question is and what it is you want to test or what it is you want to know in your research. So that's why we're looking at several different terms here and how you may, decide to use one over another because it may be more appropriate for what it is you're trying to study. But, the point of all this is that there does need to be some sort of universal ruler that we can all compare against. I would say that this is more commonly used in, countries that are less industrialized. The old term, which is not a PC term anymore, but it's third world countries.
Yeah, now
That's what
it's
they used to be called.
Global South.
It's very derogatory now.
I'm thinking, it is will be the one of the career that divided the countries into the developed country or developed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one way to think about it. But if you use this sort of, universal standard, as it were, and you think about that standard where we live, or if you're from a developing country or developed country, it's even more pronounced, isn't it? Because things cost so much more in those countries. It costs so much more to live. And so that's one of the reasons why we're going to look at, some specific measures that countries themselves use and how that may be more appropriate for what we're looking at. This is, let me see. Okay, that's the Guinea. This is percentage of population living on less than $1.25 per day. So these would be old World Bank guidelines. So before they updated to the $1.90 and currently the $2.15 cut point. But this distribution is still pretty representative of what we have today. But this is just one way of looking at this World Bank Poverty Index as it applies throughout the world. So what is the percentage of population living under that cut point? And you will see that in North America, it's very low percentage of the population that are living under those conditions. When you get down into South America, that's going to increase. When you get over into Europe, up into Russia, again, looks a lot like North America. And then as you get down into Asia and Southeast Asia and African countries, we're going to see a lot more percentage of people per capita living in poverty. And of course, none of this is surprising, right? I mean, there's nothing unusual or surprising here, but along with this poverty comes limitations on life expectancy, comes, higher or lower birth rates, comes, more infectious disease or less infectious disease, more or less chronic disease, etc. And so there are multiple implications for looking at this at such a high level in terms of being really broad and in the view in the perspective, if you will. So relative poverty. The other term you'll see for this is relative deprivation. And you may just see the term deprivation because I've seen that as well. So again, this is where something is being compared to something else, right? And so relative poverty has to do with my financial standing in the society I live in relative to others around me in my society. So relative to others in South Carolina, relative to others in the Southeast, relative to others on the Eastern Seaboard, the United States, whatever, right? So this is more of a socially defined and socially dependent construct because it is reflective of the broader society. It has something to do with your standing in the broader society. One of the measures is this Gini coefficient, which is a really interesting measure. So we've got another map here that looks at, the Gini index distribution around the world. So what is the Gini index? The Gini index ranges from 0 to 100. Zero means that everybody in the country has exactly the same income. There is no inequality whatsoever. And of course, there's no country like that. 100 means that one person has all the money. And again, there's no country like that. Maybe North Korea is the closest. Quite possibly. I don't know. Can you think of another example?
I don't know.
Where?
Brunei,
Brunei? That would be very similar.
Sultan owns practically everything.
Yeah. So those are going to be on the high end, but nobody is 100. And the average or median, if you will, is like 40, just to give you a point of reference here. And so when you say, your country's Gini index is 25 or 37 or 62, it's not very intuitive, right? But it does put all countries on the same scale. And so you can rank countries or you can compare countries directly as a result of that.
I think
So-
our country would be a different color in 2023 from 2019.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I mean, this is dated, but it's definitely dated, it's, 10 years old. But it's still, for the broad explanation, it still fits the bill, but I think you're right, it's probably, not the same, and this map would change quite a bit, like multiple countries would change. But this just gives you, an understanding of the application of the Gini index. But both of these are very broad comparisons in nature, right? Both of these last two mapping examples we looked at are very. So now we can come to a more specific measure of poverty. And so, each country has its own unique measure of poverty, and the United States certainly does. So poverty was actively measured going back to like the late 50s, early 60s. And so over time, we've had this quote official poverty measure, and we've had some variations of that measure that uses the same data source, but it's just expressed in a different way along the way. And so around 1975, we get this additional measure that is below 50% of federal poverty level. So federal poverty level means that, you're at poverty. So we're looking at the poverty rate over time here from 1960 to 2015. We see how it decreases down towards the 1970s, and then we kind of waffle a little bit, right, from then until 2015. So these would be all the people who meet the official definition of being at poverty. Those who are much worse off would be those who are at or below this 50% federal poverty level. And that's something that we began to measure in the mid-1970s. More recently, closer to about 2008 or 9, I believe, is when we have this supplementary poverty measure. So it's an additional variation. But our standard in the United States is this official poverty line that we've used for so long. I've seen the 50% federal poverty level used fairly often. And the supplemental poverty measure, I've not really seen that in research. Anything that I've read in particular. And so what's really interesting here is kind of getting into the details and nitty gritty of what exactly does this mean. So the official poverty measure, the unit definition would be families or households. We're looking at before tax cash income. And so, Sophie, your question about, is that $1 per day? Is that income? Is it, the family net worth? All of these things are very important in terms of what is the specific definition right? You need to know that. So that's why we're looking at these details just in a sort of superficial way, but just to make the point that when you're looking for data sources that match your research question, you have to dig into those data sources to understand what those numbers mean you're extracting, that you're using in your analysis. So we are looking at, and then also the supplementary poverty measure, which is the most, which is the newest of the three. All related individuals who live at the same address, including cohabitants and their relatives and foster children. So that measure is slightly different, so it can pick up, you know, one or a few more individuals or less with that measure than you do with the official poverty measure. So again, that's very important. You want to know if the measure you're using is capturing the people you're studying, right? And so that would be a distinction you would want to make in understanding the difference between the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure as to whether or not one would be better suited for your needs. Let's see here. So what is the supplemental poverty measure here? That is equivalent to money income from all sources. And all sources include housing subsidies, energy assistance, lunch program assistance, supplemental nutrition assistance, WIC, refundable tax credits, and then you take out of that federal income taxes, state income taxes, all these other things over here. So this gives you a much more detailed definition of how that's measured and what that means. Now, moving on to the UK, they have something called the Townsend Index. And your readings for this week, one of them, the chapter that's on poverty has mention of this in there, and some of the data we'll look at today come from that chapter. So it's important to include that. But again, this would be specific to the UK. Yes, ma'am.
I couldn't find any readings in the folder.
There's two PDF files in the folder.
I'm not seeing. I'm only seeing the PowerPoint. Yeah, me too.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I can see it from my end.
Sorry. Because before Romeo said that, I just because my mistake. Yeah, I saw it earlier on Canvas while you were pulling up the PowerPoint, and I got a little confused.
Okay. Well, remind me when we finish lecture today, and I'll look and make sure that that's not, you know, checked to be hidden or something. So thank you for letting me know. So Townsend Index of Deprivation, it's a composite indicator that looks at unemployment percentage of households with no car, extent of overcrowding, and housing tenure. So one thing to immediately understand about the Townsend Index is that this is taken into account of various factors in its calculation. And that is, by the way, why it's referred to as an index. So any index measure is going to be something that is made up of, it's multidimensional in nature. There's a number of things that are taken into account to calculate an index. So higher deprivation is associated with higher rates of premature death, psychiatric morbidity, unemployment, living alone. Is it getting too dark in here?
No, it just.
Okay. I noticed one of those went down. So these are the things that are associated with higher deprivation, which are the kinds of things we would you know, simply understand to be associated with poverty and with other terms we use related to that, right? So let's look at deprivation and smoking. So we've got cigarette smoking by deprivation in the United Kingdom. So we've got 1973 with the light colored bars and 2003 with the dark colored bars. So just looking at the years, what can we say? We can say that smoking was decreasing from 1973 to 2003 across all levels of income or deprivation, except for at the poorest level, where we see it's slightly higher in 2003, probably not statistically significant, but we could just, without knowing the p-value and confidence intervals on this, right? We could say that, we would just say that's the same. And so we've got this general trend, but the general trend doesn't hold for the poorest category, which is super interesting in and of itself. That it decreased across all levels of income except for the poorest. So that is, it's really, really interesting. And so that raises a lot of questions, right? Why would that be? Why would we see smoking decreasing over this, 30-year period across all levels of income in the UK except for one category?
Well, a lot of people use smoking as like a de-stressor. So, you know, despite their status, they might continue to buy cigarettes because they think it helps them relax or calm down.
So there could be psychological reasons. There could be cultural reasons. Maybe smoking is just more widely accepted among the poorest of the poor, as opposed to other, levels of income or SES. Well, SES is be more commonly used over here. So we've got a psychological reason, we've got a sociological or cultural reason. Maybe that would be anthropological, sociological. I don't know which, but one of the two. What are some other reasons you might think of?
Education, like poor people are less educated and they live out of.
Could be education, yeah.
Also,
Could
could be accessibility, like here you see like baking shops and stuff in
Yeah.
poor neighborhoods, like
Yeah.
it's more accessible.
Yeah, so now we're getting into the environment, right? So that's physical environment, that's actual physical accessibility. But there could be some other social or policy factors that go into even allowing that to be, right? So, in higher income areas or neighborhoods, there are constraints on the types of businesses that can even be there. There are constraints on the kinds of things that can be sold. And so, that could be very much related to policy, but policy alone is it's not one simple explanation. There's other things that go into how did that policy even come to be, and why does it happen over here and not over there? Now we get into all these really complex and complicated things that are just frankly really fun to try to sort through and figure out, right? And that's the kind of things that sociologists in particular are interested in. But more specifically, since we're talking about health-related behaviors here, unhealthy behaviors in particular, social epidemiologists would be interested in this, and so would the social behavioral scientists in the public health would also be interested in this. So where the epidemiologists are, so where the sociologists would look at this, and they would want to understand why that is from a societal perspective. How does power factor into this? Because sociologists always study power. Power structure is a big common theme in sociological research. The epidemiologists would be interested in just understanding distinctions between different strata within our society, which is exactly what I just said is what we're looking at here, this bar chart. The social and behavioral scientist would say, thank you, epidemiologists, for this data. Now, this is what we think we should need to do about this. So each field has its own unique perspective on either understanding whether or not and why this exists, where this exists among groups and strata within society, and an intervention standpoint. What can we do to change this? So what's interesting is, the point that I made about policy can be one of the many explanations for what we see here. An actual intervention could be policy related to change policies. So then everything kind of comes back full circle. You find this problem, you link it to poverty. Poverty, at least policy at least partially explains the disparities that we see here, but then our solution is about changing policy. So we have this kind of iterative process in public health. So now we're looking at smoking cessation and deprivation in the UK on deprivation score. So this is stopping smoking. And again, we see a decreasing trend or an increasing trend. In this case, we're really looking at sort of the flip side of the coin now, aren't we? We see an increasing trend in smoking cessation by deprivation group, but we see that trend diminish as we get closest to the poorest group, where again, smoking cessation, which is actively stopping smoking, is exactly the same in the poorest group. So that is telling us the same story, although we're asking a different question here than what we were just looking at a slide ago. But we see that there's a real problem with the poorest of the poor when it comes to stopping smoking, as well as the rates. And of course, we would expect the rates and smoking cessation to mirror one another, right? Here we've got the rates of current and ever smoked among men and women by deprivation. So now we're looking at this not only by deprivation score, but we're also stratifying what we were previously looking at by gender. So we're adding one more layer of stratification here. And so what do we see? Does this look similar to this, which is everybody lumped together? Very similar. What we do see when we stratify by male and female is that the poorest category is not as close for some reason. So that's also interesting. But one thing that stands consistent is that as you move towards the most affluent category, as you move up through those categories, we see the discrepancy between the 2 years much more significant, whether it's everybody altogether or whether we're looking at this by men and women. So again, the sociological perspective is going to be looking more at the power structure. It's going to be looking at the culture within society. And there are two sort of competing sub-perspectives within sociological research. So the structural functionists, to them, stratification and inequality are actually constructive phenomena that benefit society. Specifically, that the privileges attached to high status, incentive, motivated, qualified people who work to achieve those positions, that this is logical and it makes sense. So according to this perspective, inequality ensures that the most functionally important jobs are filled by the best qualified people. The conflict theorists argue that stratification is dysfunctional and harmful to society, and that it results in competition between the rich and poor as individuals act for their own economic advantage. And the implications here would be that they would put forward that competition and inequality are not inevitable, but are created and maintained by people trying to gain access to scarce resources. So these are two very distinct perspectives that do not align with one another. And if you think about it, these two perspectives are almost completely present in, especially in our political system. I mean, these arguments, you could say, you could assign one of these to Republicans and the other to Democrats, right? I think that's pretty safe to say. I'm treading on dangerous ground here now, but I haven't said anything that's disputable, right? So, but the point is that these are not in line with one another. They're very different. So on the one hand, you've got, ideas like the playing field should be leveled, competition should not be a thing. That's what society should look like. The other end, put in plain language, would be that competition is natural, competition is normal, and it exists, and that's why things are the way they are, and that's just how it is, right? That's not the most eloquent summarization of these two, but I think that captures both of them. And so this is very important to consider when you're looking at literature and when you're reading published literature, whether that be coming directly from sociological research or even within public health. These things are also going to be reflected in what you see. You'll be able to pick up on it in the introduction of a paper, or the kinds of things that someone's presenting at a conference, the kinds of things that they say to set the stage. These things are going to come through in the actual research questions that are asked, because the research questions you ask have to align with whatever your particular perspective on this is. And that's not to say that you're a conflict theorist, and so every research question you raise is going to fall within this realm, and it's going to test, whether or not competition is needed or natural or what have you. You may actually be testing the other things that the other camp believes, because you're interested in studying that. Why would people think that way? And maybe is there a way for me to disprove that group of thinking? So, but for the most part, your research questions are going to align or fall within these two very different viewpoints we have here. So just some facts about poverty. Those living in poverty suffer lower life expectancy, and about a third of all deaths are due to poverty-related causes. People of color, women, and children are overrepresented among the global poor, and the effects of severe poverty or extreme poverty. Those living in poverty suffer disproportionately from hunger, starvation, and disease. And this is a quote from the World Health Organization and the United Nations. Hunger and malnutrition are the single gravest threats to the world's public health, and malnutrition is by far the biggest contributor to child mortality, present in half of all cases. So regardless of your perspective on things, these are facts. These statements come directly from data. Now, you may interpret these facts and data differently depending on what your perspective is. But these are not to be disputed. They've been proven over and over. Poverty is also strongly associated with many other things that don't surprise us. Low education, juvenile delinquency, early childbearing, lack of shelter, poor water and sanitation, violence, and discrimination. All of these, by the way, have many health implications. The experience of poverty is rarely static and unchanging, and it has a cumulative effect. What does that sound like to you? That term? I mean, that sentence? Something we've studied in this class? The experience of poverty is
Accumulation of risk.
life force theory. Yeah. Exactly. Health outcomes in adulthood reflect the accumulating influence of poor socioeconomic circumstances throughout life. Again, life course theory, right? Adverse socioeconomic conditions in adulthood compound these earlier life influences, resulting in health differentials in adulthood, which reflect social patterning of exposure acting across the life course. I saw a typo in this slide and the previous slide, and I'm about to lose my mind up here right now. I can't stand that. So this entire slide, we're talking about things that are sort of common knowledge or pretty common knowledge about poverty and how it relates to health. And each one of these would fall under life course theory. And so if these are the things we're interested in studying, we have these 4 frameworks, right? There's actually more, but we looked at 4 life course theories. There's some sub-theories, right? But there's 4 predominant life course theories we can use to overlay on studying these things that are represented on this slide. So when you read a sentence like this, or you read a paragraph that sounds like this, when you leave this class, I want you to think, that's life course theory. That'll make me very happy.
For the ACEs, which have become more well known in the past few years, it's adverse childhood events when a child's life is unstable due to parents that aren't working, or violence in the home, or substance use, or instability of having, housing or food. Those all result in this type of some of the things you had on the last slide.
Yeah. So now the question is, where do those factors you just listed and these factors align themselves when we're studying why? Why being infant mortality or any health indicator you can think of, right? So what I'm getting at is which one of those things you listed, if any, precede these, which results in infant mortality or some other thing we're studying. And that is exactly how I want you to think about health determinants when you leave this course. So early on in the course, we had these very constrained theories that were this happens and then that happens and then this happens, right? And that's easy to do when you're working with a few psychological constructs, right? But now we're dealing with bigger picture stuff. These things are much more complicated. There's more of them. So then the question becomes, what precedes what? Which ones of these things are mediators or moderators? Which things are simply risk factors that result from some step in this process? And so there's all these many different things we can look at from a social epidemiological perspective. We want to understand how the puzzle fits together. When we have, you don't have to have all pieces of the puzzle, but at least most of them, you have a pretty good picture of what's going on. That's when the social behavioral scientists can come in and say, okay, well, we know these things. Still some question marks over here, but we know these things. Let's start developing interventions to deal with that, right? Meanwhile, the epidemiologists continue to work on filling in the blanks for where we don't have those puzzle pieces. So what I want you to think about is we've looked at a number of different ways of organizing our determinants of health that would be related to whatever it is we're studying, right? And when you do that, you have to think about the sequence of events. You have to think about the order of things. And you have to think about things also in terms of whether or not certain health determinants or factors lie in the causal pathway of what it is you're studying and the other important predictors. Or are there some factors that when they're introduced into the mix, you see that this holds true for males but not females, for young but not old, to give simple examples. That's when we have a moderating effect. And so all of this stuff is super important in terms of at the broadest level, you need to organize all of your factors together in some cohesive way, even in the absence of a theoretical framework that already exists. So essentially, you have to create your own theoretical framework that you're going to test. You do that by understanding reading as much as you can and understanding as best you can how these different factors relate to one another from the literature. And you get little glimpses here and there. You have to bring all that together to put it into, let's say, a model you want to test, right? And then when you have some understanding about whether or not this factor lies directly in the causal pathway, meaning that it's true in all cases for everybody that this next thing happens, that's a mediating relationship. Versus when we see this factor present, sometimes outcomes are different for different groups as we look at our outcome of interest. And that would indicate what's called a moderating effect, right? So the first part of that, where you're organizing things, that's where you can use socio-ecological model. You can use even life course theory to some degree, gives you some structure. In the mix where you have any psychosocial factors, you can plug in some of the theories and models we talked about in class. And then other times there are other models that we haven't even talked about in this class that kind of look like some version of socio-ecological model, but it's all constrained to the healthcare system. Let's say there's a number of models that function really, or designed to function really in that space, or if you're looking at those kinds of things. This came up in a dissertation that I'm on the committee for a presentation this week. There were two models that were used in conjunction that were essentially the theoretical framework for that particular dissertation. And so that is the organizational piece of it. When you get into this factor is important and it has an influence for everybody, again, that's a mediating kind of question. Or you have the other situation where this factor is important, but we see different outcomes for different groups. That is a moderating question. The way you word your research questions then are going to be different when you're assuming or you're testing a causal relationship versus a moderating relationship. Hopefully you followed all that. But what you'll see is that as you go through your other classes, some of these pieces are going to begin to fall in place. And all of our classes and the things we talk about in these classes are going to link up with one another in such a way that is preparing you to be able to do your dissertation and take into account all of this. and ask good research questions and do good analysis. So working class and mortality, let's go through these kind of quickly. So up top, we've got a male trend line, and down bottom, we've got a female trend line. So we've got different decades of data presented here, right? So up top here, we're looking at, for males, up top here, we're looking at 93 to 96. No, we're looking at 86 to 92. And the middle line here, we're looking at 93 to 96. And the bottom line with the triangles, we've got 97 to 99. So directly age standardized all cause mortality rates per 100,000 person years. Y'all are in epidemiology right now, right? So this is like, I've heard enough of this this semester. In England and Wales, this is for males aged 35 to 64, from 86 to 99. So these working classes aren't meaningful to you because you don't have the definitions of them. And actually, let me see. Here we are in the notes. These lower rates, as we would expect, are among the quote professional class worker. And the middle, we've got the non-manual middle class and the manual labor middle class. And then this last category over here, the higher rates of all cause mortality would be the semi-skilled manual labor. So these are the hardest workers. These are the next hardest workers. These people have pretty good jobs. These people are, you know, doctors and lawyers and so on, right?
How did you get your notes down there?
It's the view. You can change your view so you have a notes.
Okay, I was looking for it one time and I couldn't find it.
Yeah.
I'm actually interested why they choose the age from 35 to 60.
This was when they did this study, at least this was middle age. They were interested in middle-aged men and women.
Middle age?
Yeah.
I just said 64 was not.
Is that what you're gonna say?
Yeah.
64 is old. So if you think about it this way, and I would agree with you, 64 is, I don't know what you call that, still middle age, and 35 is like, I'm not quite there yet. Don't call me middle aged. But this age range does a good job of capturing all of the middle aged people, right? So if I remember correctly, the context of why they were doing this, they wanted to, well, middle age is where, beginning in middle age is where you're going to see increases in rates of all-cause mortality, especially from chronic disease and lifestyle behaviors and so on. And that matches well also with the idea of what is the frequency of this happening by your, you know, occupational status, you know, from white collar worker on one end to the most manual labor you can imagine, you know, person out digging a ditch every day.
Yes, I agree with that. Because I always hear people saying the people when they get into the like the 50 or the 55 years old, they may have a higher like higher risk to get some serious disease. So
if you think about it this way, from an epidemiological perspective, this is going to capture even the tails of the distribution of all-cause mortality for those that, some of whom die younger, some of those who live a little bit longer, right?
I also think it's good to, I mean, you're going to pretty much catch like the time of everybody working. So 35 is old enough that you're going to be like usually out of school, except for, you know, a small percentage of people returning.
Yep.
And they'll be past having like younger children where people are stay-at-home moms and stuff. So in I don't know what it is for England, but here people retire like around 65. So you're catching the largest chunk of people like working.
Oh, here, people retire.
Sometimes, yeah.
Because in China, people retire. For women, it's 50, and men, it's 50.
Yeah, well, Americans aren't dead, so they work longer. We're not as good as other countries in saving.
So obvious things we can take away from still looking at the male trend here. Higher rates of all-cause mortality across the board, regardless of your occupation type, as we go from decades to the next. So we see that decreasing over time for all, right? But we have this consistent discrepancy between each one of these categories. When we look at this stratified for females, it's not as extreme as it is with males. We've seen a little more overlapping in those more recent 2 decades than we did before, but we do still see a pretty big change for the hardest workers here, which is actually good news for them. When you look at this over time, right? You see that decreasing over time. You don't see much change here at all, especially for this working class. You see a decrease for the second decade, and then there's no change from there. So these are ways we can slice and dice all this weight data we're looking at, right? So I would look at this all together first, and then look at it by male and by female. And what we can say from something like this is there's probably some sort of mediation with gender here and all-cause mortality. So that's what mediation would look like, graphically speaking. But that have to be statistically tested to know.
So you said mediating is where it kind of results in the same outcome for everyone, and then moderating was different outcomes, right?
Moderating, yes. So what we see here is that generally speaking, we see a similar trend between men and women, but when we zoom in and take a closer look, we see that, for women in this professional category, there's not a whole lot of change, and there's a good bit more change with men. In the second category, those are probably pretty equivalent in terms of what you're seeing there for men and for women. In this third category, again, we see quite a bit of reduction in all-cause mortality, more so for men than we do for women. And then we see wider gaps in all-cause mortality for men and for women at the hardest labor category. And so even though we have the same general trends, there's enough going on between these decades that there's probably visual evidence enough here to support the idea that moderation should be statistically tested to know for sure if it's actually occurring.
Did they account for regulation changes?
I don't know. I have to go back to the original study to know what they accounted for. And that's, again, a good question. Anytime you see data like this presented, you always want to ask what was being controlled for. And I hear this all the time. I'm a big podcast listener, and some of you may throw rocks at me or not, I don't know. I do listen to the most popular podcast in the world, which is the Joe Rogan podcast. Okay. Some of you guys may think he's absolutely crazy. He has really interesting people on his podcast. Okay. But when he talks about epidemiological studies, he's not a scientist. It drives me absolutely crazy because he talks about epidemiological studies as if they're not well thought out and done with rigor and so on and so forth. And of course, we all know better than that. But he always talks about, having questions about research that comes out about, especially, he talks a lot about nutritional studies. And he'll always bring up questions about, what was controlled for. And when he does that, I think there's no other scientist in the world that control for more things than epidemiologists. So, I don't know where his question is coming from, but
Maybe you should write in.
oh gosh, no. He doesn't read comments, and there's so many billions of people that send him messages that would never get through. But he's got educated people on his podcast that should be correcting him, but that's their job. But the point of saying that is that that's always a really good question to ask when you're reading an epidemiological study. What was controlled for, right? That's super, super important. And you know that from your epi study. So this is just a table of what we were looking at with the percent change. All this, I'm going to skip through that. Home and car ownership as those relate to mortality. So home ownership, car ownership says something about your financial status, does it not? So people who have more financial means are more likely to own a vehicle or to own a home than those who are less financially stable or have fewer financial means. And so what we have here is direct age standardized rate ratios for death under 65 by housing tenure and car access. 1971 and 1981 consensus cohort. This was a longitudinal study that was done again in the UK. So broken out by males and females here. So housing tenure, what do we call this group under housing tenure with the ones beside it? That's your reference group. So housing tenure, home occupiers are our reference group. It's important to know that because you need that tells you how to interpret the other values you see in the table, right? So what do we have here?
Is this one from England as well?
Yes. Yeah. So private renters and those living in social housing, we see that their rate ratios for death under 65 are increasing. So private renters are going to be compared to owners. Private renters are going to be people with more means than those who are living in social housing, but with less means than owners. So they're kind of like our middle group. And then the social housing group is going to have the fewest financial resources. They're going to be poor. And so what we see is the.
You think that's like subsidized housing? Is that similar? I don't know what social housing is.
I'd be willing to probably so. Yeah. And that would fall under what we refer to as subsidized housing. So what we see is that the rate ratio for death is increasing as we move from those who are wealthier to our middle group to our poorest group here. And then same thing with the cars. So car access, one or more cars. Having multiple cars would be an indicator of financial means and resources, right? And not having a car would be an indicator of having less financial means. Generally speaking, right? There's a lot of rich people who don't have cars or who have only a few or one car, right? But generally speaking, the more money you have, the more cars you have. And so again, when you're comparing, when you're using how many cars you have as an indicator of your wealth versus not having cars, we see that those who have cars have increased rate ratio for death before 65. So these are just some interesting ways of looking at the same kind of things. And that's really what's fun about epidemiology. What we do in public health is there's so many ways to conceptualize and measure, and then subsequently analyze things we're interested in. So moving from poverty to our last term, which was the Townsend Index. Now we're talking about social exclusion. This refers not only to the economic hardship that we've talked about with poverty, but social exclusion also has another layer to it, and it includes this idea of being marginalized. So how individuals come through their lives to be excluded from various aspects of social and community life would be related to a number of things like unemployment, poor housing, low education levels, discrimination, citizenship, integration into communities. And so especially those last two in particular. So that those last two, citizenship and integration in communities in particular, would be one of the primary links to marginalization. And I think discrimination would be sort of a symptom of that, in terms of how I think about it. So this kind of looks like a theory, right? In terms of we've got arrows and boxes and so on, but it's just one way to visually represent multiple determinants of some health outcome, any health outcome that would be related to poverty, and in this case, social exclusion. So we've got that marginalization piece to it. So they're organized with these broader headings. So factors inducing stress, economic change, socio-demographic change, changing welfare regimes, segregation processes. These are just examples, okay? In the next box, we've got elements of social exclusion. Exclusion from participation in civil society, exclusion resulting from a failure of supply of social goods or services, exclusions from social production, exclusions from normal social consumption. And then we've got affected groups, unemployed ethnic minorities, refugees, immigrants, and guest workers under that. Homeless, pensioners, lone parents, disabled, long-term sick people, and affected indicators would be unemployment, poverty, income inequality, homelessness, alcohol, and drug abuse. So if you're interested in studying some health outcome related to social deprivation, I would say this is one of the ways, as you're going through the literature, you may find that there's things that are coming up consistently. So you make your running list of these things, right? And then at some point, you begin to put these into same categories or categories that make sense in terms of organizing them, right? So we've got indicators of the affected, we've got affected groups. So these could be the people you might study.
Prisoners should be on there too.
Prisoners?
Yeah,
Could be.
people who have been jailed are associated.
Definitely could be. So again, these are examples, but yeah, that would definitely go under here. And so can you see how, even though there's no explicit model or theory or framework that we're working from, we can go through the literature and start documenting all these things we see that consistently come up. And we can begin to organize them in logical ways. And it would be very difficult to study all of this, very difficult. And so as you go through this literature and you begin to organize, you're going to have thoughts about things that are interesting to you that are going to lead you to questions like, why does this happen? Does this thing happen more often among these people? In which case you begin to determine who you're going to be sampling or who it is you're going to be studying. What are some of the symptoms or byproducts, if you will, of social deprivation, social exclusion. You would pick from this list the indicators and actual social exclusion up here. And then if you're interested in these sorts of bigger, broader forces that are linked directly to psychological stress, you might choose one or more of those, but you wouldn't do all of this. This is too much to do, especially for a dissertation. But everything you see here could be what you study in your career. That's kind of an interesting thing about it, isn't it? So I put all this stuff together and I carve out, take a piece here, a couple pieces there. I'm going to study this group and I'm interested in these particular indicators. That's what I'm going to do for my dissertation. And I'll get 3 papers out of that and presentations. But when I go to my next job or when I go to my postdoc or what have you, I want to begin to study some of these other things or look at the model I developed in my dissertation and begin to study this group now and this group now and this group now, right? And so this is how you can take literature, begin to cluster things together in terms of organizing determinants in nice, neat little buckets or bins or whatever word you want to use, categories. Partition out what can feasibly be done in a dissertation, which is one of the primary jobs of your chair, by the way. So very recently, our entire community had to help a student. You're trying to do too much. You can only do this. So let's do this and call this your dissertation. And then all the other stuff you're interested in, just do that later on in your career. That can be what gets you tenure when you start studying these other things. So if you had a question?
Yes, I actually don't understand what's the difference between the factors and the affected indicators.
Between
The factors. So this is
factors
actually
inducing stress,
the study population, right?
this is study population.
Yes. So the factors may be the influence the health outcomes.
Mhm.
And how about the affected indicators?
So these factors up here, these are what sociologists would refer to as structural factors within a society. So these kinds of things might be
Oh, so
under the influence of just the economy, broadly speaking. But some of these other things like changing welfare regimes and segregation processes, these are all policy kind of things we're talking about here. So as a result of these, we might see increases or decreases in unemployment, poverty, etc. So these are a symptom of that. And we can tie those to one particular group or more that we want to study. And then we might want to look at somewhere in the mix these exclusion factors, so these social exclusion factors that are represented here. So are these outcomes we're interested in, or do these fit somewhere in the causal pathway, which is kind of what this suggests, the way it's arranged, is that these big structural factors happen, resulting in social exclusion. These are the people who are affected, and these are the symptoms of this happening. What we might then do is add another box down here, which would be a list of common illnesses or diseases that result from this particular set of determinants we've outlined here. So when you think about unemployment, poverty, alcohol and drug abuse, we could take that down here if we wanted to. This is really a behavior. You know, unemployment, poverty, income inequality, homelessness, these are things we don't have total control over. We do have some control over, but this would be a lifestyle fact. This would be a behavior, alcohol and drug abuse. I would maybe put that in a box down here with other probably unhealthy behaviors And then maybe another box below that, that would be, you know, premature death. That would be cardiovascular disease, that would be cancer, that would be whatever, right?
So, actually, the top box is the general, like the big picture about
Yeah.
factors will influence their health outcomes.
That's sort of where everything starts. This is like what's happening in society, in your society right now.
Yeah.
Really big picture stuff.
So,
And then as a result of these things, social exclusion can happen. And these are examples of social exclusion that would be related to those big picture things that are happening in society right now, or during the period of time you're studying. As a result of social exclusion, we know there are particular subgroups that are affected by that and others that are not. And we know that there are things that commonly are seen with social exclusion. And then we can go down into behaviors and actual health outcomes. So that's how you could continue to build that out. And you could literally spend an entire career in something like this.
is it safe to assume that the social exclusion is part of structural violence?
Say it again.
Is it safe to assume that social exclusion is a part of structural violence?
Structural violence? Quite possibly. Yeah.
Is that something I can take up for case study?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Did you find the paper already?
I am trying to find.
That sounds like it would definitely fit.
Yeah, structural violence is something I'm very interested in.
Yeah, that would most certainly fit within what we're talking about here. Yeah. All right, so I know I took a lot of time on that, but there are a lot of policy implications for when we think about poverty and we think about deprivation and we think about social exclusion. I won't read all of these to you because you know, these are just examples, and it's not an exhaustive list by any means. But this this would be, you know, along the lines of policy interventions we might be interested in doing in public health. And we would want to look at, so we think of when policy is changed or created and implemented from nothing that existed before. There's multiple ways this happens. We then want to see what happens as a result of that, because we think that if we change this policy or if we implement a policy that doesn't exist, that needs to be there, we expect something good to happen, right? So in that regard, creating new policy or changing existing policy is basically your treatment. Think of that as your treatment. So in interventional research, that's how you would look at poverty, think about policy. All right, now moving on to race, ethnicity, and health. Infant mortality rates for mothers aged 20 and over in the United States in 1995. So we've got white mothers and black mothers, less than 12 years of education, 12 years of education, 13 to 15 years of education, 16 years or more. So essentially, top line here would be didn't finish high school. 12 years would be finished high school or got a GED. 3 to 15 years would be bachelor's degree, associate or bachelor's degree, and then 16 plus would be, you know, master's doctoral degree, white and black. So infant mortality rates for mothers age 20 and over in the United States, 1995. What do we see? We see the highest infant mortality rates among those with the lowest education level. And we see that infant mortality rate decreasing as education level increases. That's true for white and it's also true for black. But what is absolutely wild about this table is that worst case scenario for white is better than best case scenario for black. So when you see data like this, you go, holy cow. This just did not look like that. What's going on here? So we can ask all sorts of questions, and there's obviously implications for interventions to take place here. So the black-white ratio we have here for infant mortality rates is also is also wild as we look at how that ratio increases from the least educated to the most educated. It's crazy. Ethnic differences in socioeconomic indicators in England. So this is looking at, again, working class data. So it links back to some of that data we talked about before. So these 1s and 2s are our white collar professionals, right? We've got our sort of middle class workers, non manual labor and manual labor, and then we've got our hardcore manual laborers here in this group. And this just breaks things out, you know, comparing all of these different ethnic groups and racial groups that are in the UK to the English white. And there's also a white minority group here they're making comparisons to. So some differences in, you know, those who come from who were Caucasian, that come from other places within the UK and Europe. And so we see some differences here in terms of employment rates. When we look at the white Englishes, which would be our reference group, and these other groups, we see differences in the percent who are in white collar versus middle class, so to speak, versus the hardest of the hard labor groups. And one or two groups that consistently come up here that are just in stark contrast to the others of the Pakistani and the Bangladeshi groups. They definitely are having some of the hardest times here. So again, we could ponder on this for quite a while, but when you have data like this is basic epidemiological or economic data, in this case, where we can clearly identify inequalities in some of the factors that would be related to a number of health outcomes. Let's see, this is ethnic differences in reported fair or bad general health in England. So I think we're all familiar with this common question, right, from behavioral risk factor surveillance system and other types of surveys where you self-rate your health from fair to excellent. That's what we're talking about here. And so we've got the odds ratio compared with the white English, reporting fair or bad general health. So the odds ratio for the Bangladeshi group is the highest. We still see the Pakistani group is pretty high, although you've got some of the Caribbean and Indian here on confidence intervals. Chinese down lower, and white minority being a group here. So again, just another way to look at it. Death rates in the U.S. by median family income in the area of residence. So what do we see in terms of death rate? We see that those who earn the least are more of them per 100 person years. We see a larger value there than those higher income levels. And that is a trend that's consistent among both white men and black men. But if we were to draw lines straight across here in our different categories, it's not until we get into these middle categories, this one in particular, that we see some difference. And then again on the higher, close to the higher end, we see the difference. So data like this is a little harder to interpret because the general trend we see for both is very similar. And so there's just some specific subgroups that we might be interested in taking a look at in terms of why there's some differences there. And then we have to figure out what is the meaning of that. What does that actually tell us? So percentage of men and women reporting fair or poor health by race and income. So we've got, we're going from the poorest to the highest income. And we see, as we would expect, the percentage of men and the percentage of women decreasing in terms of the proportion who are reporting fair to poor health, right? But who do we see as we look at the race ethnicity strata here? Even within one of these income categories, we definitely see discrepancies among Black and Hispanic versus the whites, even within the same category. So, general statement here is that fair or poor health is going to be reported more often the more poor you are. But even at any particular financial status category, there's almost always a discrepancy or an inequality when comparing Blacks and Hispanics to whites. Which again, one makes sense, the other is like, why is that? That's why we study health disparities. We've looked at this data a couple of times already, so I'm going to skip through that. So now we can get into things like, well, racism, racial discrimination, structural racism, etc. Racial harassment, racial discrimination, and the risk of fair or poor health. So what is the relation? The research question will be, what is the relationship of racial harassment, racial discrimination to the risk of fair or poor health as reported similarly as we've seen before. So the experience of racial harassment, no racial harassment, that's our reference group. That makes sense, right? We want to know the other cases. So verbal abuse and physical abuse. Does it seem logical that the odds of reporting risk of reporting fair or poor health is higher among those who have been verbally abused in a racial way versus those who have never been verbally abused? Does it make sense that those who have been physically attacked have a greater odds of reporting fair or poor health than those who have been verbally abused and those who have not been attacked? Yeah, that seems escalating, right? So it's one thing for someone to say something racially mean to you. It's another thing for someone to attack you for racial reasons, right? So that's not surprising. Perception of discrimination. Fewer than half of employers discriminate. Most employers discriminate. So again, we don't see anything unusual there. Occupational class. Non-manual is our reference group, and then we've got manual laborers, and then we've got no full-time worker in the household. So really, this would be one indicator of poverty. If you think about it, non-manual, this would be people with higher means financially. Manual laborers are going to be people who have some kind of income, but it's not going to be as high. And then no full-time worker in the household, well, that's worst case scenario. So it's not surprising that we see increasing odds of reporting fair or poor health in those categories. So a few summary slides here. Data from industrialized countries support the possibility that ethnic inequalities in health are largely a consequence of socioeconomic differentials. Experiences of racial harassment and discrimination and perceptions of living in a discriminatory society contribute to ethnic inequalities in health. Macro social factors and racism are the basic causes of racial differences in health. And the overarching question here, just as an example, there could be many others. How do markers of social inequality relate to psychosocial and biological markers of stress, and how does this translate into disease outcomes? So that would be like a big general research question you might have, but when you do your dissertation, you would want to break that out into sub questions, right? So best case scenario, can I get 3 really good questions out of this bigger, broader question for paper 1, paper 2, and paper 3 that I have to do for dissertation? So I'm just planting seeds for y'all to think about how to go about your dissertation. So some specific aims and hypotheses we might test in this realm here. So first one would be to compare racial differences in the rate of postpartum depression in women who have delivered preterm, and examine the incidence and differential for those women who reside in deprived communities. Again, typo. So a hypothesis we might test there: African American women who reside in deprived communities are more likely to deliver preterm and have higher rates of postpartum depression. So it could be argued that we actually have 2 hypotheses there, right? Because we have this word "and" in there. If I were the chair of this dissertation, I would say, let's make this a clean analysis and keep this aim up here as it is, but let's have 2 hypotheses you're testing. And, you know, that, again, implications for analysis. Because think about it this way: if you test this hypothesis, you've got more stuff in the model you're running, right? But if you break this out into hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2, it's a lot cleaner.
For our case study, is that it can be about poverty or race, or it includes
Either
both?
Either one, and more than likely, both are going to show up in that paper. It's very common.
I know, but I was thinking about racism in healthcare, which wouldn't necessarily, it might not talk about poverty, so I just wanted to make sure that would be.
Oh, sure, yeah. Yeah, you can find one that focuses, you know, really exclusively on one versus the other, race, ethnicity, and health, or poverty, deprivation, etc., in health. But again, a lot of papers are, you're going to see, they're going to, if you're looking at poverty, social exclusion, these sorts of things, usually there's some sort of relationship with race, ethnicity that comes up in there, or gender, or something else. And then if you're looking at racism, kind of by default, you've got race, ethnicity in it, but it's implied in the broad category. You got to have different groups. At least one group being oppressed in some way. Just use the word oppression broadly. And the reason would be because of their race.
Right, but it just wouldn't necessarily include poverty.
Exactly, that's true. That's true.
So when we look at the N1, what do you think they can get data?
When we look at the first hypothesis,
Yes. What do you think they can collect?
African American women who reside in deprived communities are more likely to deliver preterm. So what you would need to do, you would need to have like census tract data. You wouldn't necessarily have to have. You could collect, or possibly it exists in. If you're collecting primary data, I'm sorry. If you're collecting primary data, you could ask the person their address. Understanding that your study is, by IRB implication, their anonymity and privacy and all these things are going to be protected. But
I think
What-
I think she's asking if there's a database for that.
yeah, so this is a long-winded answer to get to that. So if you're collecting primary data, you can ask for an address. More than likely, you're going to take those addresses you get and you're going to plug them into some other broader unit like a census tract. Okay. If it's secondary data, more than likely there are not individual addresses in there, but you may have census tract data. And then with the preterm delivery, that's going to be from, hospital electronic medical records. So you may have to take a person's self-reported address and link that to your preterm data, or you have census tract data from one source and preterm delivery from another source that you have together to build this data you need. More than likely, those are not going to be in the same place. Well, I should say more than likely. You won't necessarily have both of those pieces of information in the same data set that already exists.
Yes, because
It's possible, but not necessarily so.
I would say the hypothesis actually two aims, because they actually have health outcomes. For the first one, I must say they can connect data like from the hospital records, but I'm actually interested about the second one. They also can collect data from the hospital records.
It's pretty common. Depression screeners are pretty common for a lot of health encounters. I have been asked what I knew were obvious questions about whether or not I was depressed. For regular doctor visits, I've been asked questions like that before I had surgery. I had both shoulders operated.
Didn't get a B12 shot at the I was like, seriously, like, just coming to get a shot, I should just be able to come in, get out, and it was all this.
So again, that data may be in a secondary data set already, but if you're collecting primary data, sky's the limit. You just gotta get it IRB approved and approved by your dissertation committee. You can collect whatever data you want to, but you're gonna do a lot of work with somebody accesses the secondary data set.
If we want to collect the primary data, it will be hard to find the post-op depression. It's more hard on this.
Yeah, that's gonna be more, hospital administrative data kind of things. Those would be things that would commonly be screened for, and post-birth visits. So thing two, to examine prenatal care results of reduction in risk as part of depression, specifically for African women. And the hypothesis related there would be the risk of preterm birth and postpartum depression will be less for those women who receive group prenatal care, and the greatest reduction in risk will be observed in racial minorities. So really interesting questions. Here is another sort of conceptualization of race, ethnicity relates in some way to patient-provider communication, and both of those are related to quality of care and what we refer to as patient activation. So patient activation, if you don't know what that is active self-care of a person who's being studied or who's in this clinical situation you're interested in. So using that as the backdrop, here are some possible interesting questions you could pose. That sort of structure you develop. Does provider experience influence observed ethnic disparities in patient-provider communication? Does provider caseload influence observed ethnic disparities in patient-provider communication? Does provider ethnicity influence observed ethnic disparities in patient-provider communication? And does clinical staff ethnic makeup influence observed ethnic disparities in patient-provider communication? So again, those are just some examples of questions that could be asked. There are many more, but those would all be relevant given these clusters and how. Research question: are there racial ethnic inequalities in breast cancer stage and diagnosis among women in South Carolina? Hypothesis would be in South Carolina, African American and Hispanic women have higher incidence rates of late stage breast cancer compared to white women. Research question 2: how does geographic access to mammography facilities influence racial ethnic disparities in health and breast cancer at breast cancer stage of diagnosis for women in South Carolina? Hypothesis: in South Carolina, a higher percentage of racial ethnic minorities will have fewer mammography facilities per square mile and fewer, good gracious, facilities per individual than counties with higher percentages of non-minorities. This was a funded study, by the way. So these are actual research questions, not hypotheses. Oh, I'm sorry.
It's the hypersensitivity is actually it's like
To your project?
Yes. I thought so.
Great minds think alike.
So just a couple of wrap-up slides here. Different social groups, whether defined by race, ethnicity, gender, income, education, or region, experience oftentimes or many times dramatically different levels of health. For instance, in the US, we know that people with lower educational attainment have higher mortality than those with higher levels of education, and that's true in many other countries as well. Men have higher mortality than women, and we have differences in life expectancy when we begin to cross the layers of race, ethnicity, and gender. So African American men, life expectancy 70, Caucasian women 80. So 10 years difference on average. So the public health assumptions, based on what we've talked about, health disparities are largely socially constructed on the basis of race, ethnicity, gender, education, income, and region, and there could be other factors we could include as well, and not the result primarily of poor genetics. Health disparities can be reduced, and in some cases maybe even eliminated, although that is like oftentimes an unreachable goal, through comprehensive, coordinated, and sustained public health efforts directed at the behaviors, systems, and broader social and policy environments that promote health and prevent disease. And then lastly, I've got a really cool video we can watch. Maria and Jordan, can you see the video pop up?
For me,
No,
it's
I'm
still
not
the
seeing it.
PowerPoint.
Okay, let me change my view. How about
We
now?
can see it now.
When you hit it, I'll make sales. At least what part of it. You hear that? While this is running, I'm gonna excuse me.
Can't hear anything.
Oh, you can't hear?
No, sorry. I heard some stuff and I thought maybe it was the video.
So,
If when you share, there should be share with sound.
so I need to stop sharing. So dial this back. Stop share.
You see share with sound. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, that should work. Maria? So I think she can hear that, but maybe not me. You can hear it?
About 10 years ago, I took on the
Okay,
task
I can hear now.
development of Swedish undergraduate students. That was after having spent about 20 years together with African institutions studying hunger in Africa. I was sort of expected to know a little about the world. And I started in our medical university, Karolinska Institute, an undergraduate course called Global Health. But when you get that opportunity, you get a little nervous. I thought these students coming to us actually have the highest grade you can get in Swedish college system. So I thought maybe they know everything I'm going to teach them about. So I did a pre-test when they came. And one of the questions from which I learned a lot was this one: which country has the highest child mortality of these 5 pairs? And I put them together so that in each pair of country, one has twice the child mortality of the other. And this means that it's much bigger the difference than the uncertainty of the data. I won't put you at a test here, but it's Turkey, which is highest there, Poland, Russia, Pakistan, and South Africa. And these were the results of the Swedish students. I did it so I got a confidence interval, which was pretty narrow, and I got happy, of course. I had 1.8 right answer out of 5 possible. That means that there was a place for a professor of international health and for my course. But one late night, when I was compiling the report, I really realized my discovery. I have shown that Swedish top students know statistically significantly less about the world than the chimpanzees. Because the chimpanzee would score half right. If I gave them 2 bananas with Sri Lanka and Turkey, they would be right half of the cases. But the students are not there. The problem for me was not ignorance, it was preconceived ideas. I did also an unethical study of the professors of the Karolinska Institute that hands out the Nobel Prize in medicine, and they are on par with the chimpanzee there. So this is where I realized that there was really a need to communicate, because the data of what's happening in the world and the child health of every country is very well aware. So we did this software which displays it like this. Every bubble here is a country. This country over here is, this is China. This is India. The size of the bubble is the population. And on this axis here, I put fertility rate. Because my students, what they said when they looked upon the world, and I asked them, what do you really think about the world? Huh? Well, I first discovered that the textbook was Tintin mainly. And they said the world is still we and them. And we is Western world, and them is third world. And what do you mean with Western world? I said, well, that's long life in small family, and third world is short life in large family. So this is what I could display here. I put fertility rate here, number of children per woman, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to about 8 children per woman. We have very good data since 1962, 1960 about, on the size of families in all countries. The error margin is narrow. Here I put life expectancy at birth, from 30 years in some countries up to about 70 years. And 1962, there was really a group of countries here that was industrialized countries, and they had small families and long lives. And these were the developing countries. They had large families and they had relatively short lives. Now, what has happened since 1962? We want to see the change. Are the students right? It's still two types of countries? Or have these developing countries got smaller families and they live here? Or have they got longer lives and live up there? Let's see. We stop the world. And this is all UN statistic that has been available. Here we go. Can you see there? It's China. They're moving against better health. They're improving there. All the green Latin American countries, they are moving towards smaller families. The yellow ones here are the Arabic countries, and they get larger families, but longer lives, but not larger families. The Africans are the green down here. They still remain here. This is India. Indonesia is moving on pretty fast. And in the 80s here, you have Bangladesh still among the African countries there. But now Bangladesh, it's a miracle that happens in the 80s. The imams start to promote family planning, and they move up into that corner. And in 90s, we have the terrible HIV epidemic that takes down the life expectancy of the African countries, and all the rest of the world moves up into the corner where we have long lives and small family, and we have a completely new world. Let me make a comparison directly between United States of America and Vietnam. 1964. America had small families and long life. Vietnam had large families and short lives. And this is what happens. The data during the war indicate that even with all the death, there was an improvement of life expectancy. By the end of the year, the family planning started in Vietnam, and they went for smaller families. And the United States up there is getting for longer life, keeping family size. And in the 80s now, they give up communist planning and they go for market economy, and it moves faster even than social life. And today we have in Vietnam the same life expectancy and the same family size here in Vietnam 2003 as in United States 1974 by the end of the war. I think we all, if we don't look in the data, we underestimate the tremendous change in Asia, which was in social change before we saw the economical change. So let's move over to another way here in which we could display the distribution in the world of the income. This is the world distribution of income of people. $1, $10, or $100 per day. There's no gap between rich and poor any longer. This is a myth. There's a little hump here. But there are people all the way. And if we look where the income ends up, the income, this is 100% of world's annual income. And the richest 20%, they take out of that about 74%. And the poorest 20%, they take about 2%. And this shows that the concept developing countries is extremely doubtful. We sort of think about aid, like these people here giving aid to these people here. But in the middle, we have most of the world population, and they have now 24% of the income. We heard it in other forms. And who are these? Where are the different countries? I can show you Africa. This is Africa. 10% of world population, most in poverty. This is OECD, the rich country, the country club of the UN. And they are over here on this side, and quite an overlap between Africa and OECD. And this is Latin America. It has everything on this earth, from the poorest to the richest in Latin America. And on top of that, we can put East Europe, we can put East Asia, and we put South Asia. And how did it look like if we go back in time to about 1970? Then there was more of a hump. And we have most who lived in absolute poverty were Asians. The problem in the world was the poverty in Asia. And if I now let the world move forward, you will see that while population increase, there are hundreds of millions in Asia getting out of poverty, and some others get into poverty. And this is the pattern we have today. And the best projection from the World Bank is that this will happen. And we will not have a divided world. We will have most people in the middle. Of course, it's a logarithmic scale here. But our concept of economy is growth with percent. We look upon it as a possibility of percentage increase. If I change these and I take GDP per capita instead of family income, and I turn these individual data into regional data of gross domestic product. And I take the regions down here. The size of the bubble is still the population, and you have the OECD there, and you have sub-Saharan Africa there, and we take off the Arab states there, coming both from Africa and from Asia, and we put them separately, and we can expand this axis, and I can give it a new dimension here by adding the social values there, child survival. Now I have money on that axis, and I have the possibility of children to survive there. In some countries, 99.7% of children survive to 5 years of age, others only 70. And here it seems that there is a gap between OECD, Latin America, East Europe, East Asia, Arab states, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The linearity is very strong between child survival and money. But let me split Sub-Saharan Africa. Health is there, and better health is up there. I can go here, and I can split Sub-Saharan Africa into its countries. And when it bursts, the size of each country bubble is the size of the population. Sierra Leone down there, Mauritius up there. Mauritius was the first country to get away with trade barriers, and they could sell their sugar, they could sell their textiles on equal terms as the people in Europe and North America. There's a huge difference between Africa, and Ghana is here in the middle. In Sierra Leone, humanitarian aid. Here in Uganda, development aid. Here, time to invest. There you can go for holiday. It's a tremendous variation within Africa, which we very often make that it's equal everything. I can split South Asia here. India is the big bubble in the middle, but huge difference between Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. And I can split Arab states. How are they? Same climate, same culture, same religion, huge difference. Even between neighbors. Yemen, civil war, United Arab Emirates money, which was quite equally and well used. Not as the myth is. And that includes all the children of the foreign workers who are in the country. Data is often better than you think. Many people say that data is bad. There is an uncertainty margin. But we can see the difference here, Cambodia, Singapore. The differences are much bigger than the weakness of the data. East Europe, Soviet economy for a long time, but they come out after 10 years very, very differently. And there is Latin America. Today we don't have to go to Cuba to find a healthy country in Latin America. Chile will have a lower child mortality than Cuba within some few years from now. And here we have high-income countries in OECD, and we get the whole pattern here of the world, which is more or less like this. And if we look at it, how it looks the world, in 1960, it starts to move, 1960. This is Mao Zedong. He brought health to China. And then he died, and then Deng Xiaoping came and brought money to China and brought them into the mainstream again. And we have seen how countries move in different directions like this. So it's sort of difficult to get an example country which shows the pattern of the world. But I would like to bring you back to about here at 1960. And I would like to compare South Korea, which is this one, with Brazil, which is this one. The label went away for me here. And I would like to compare Uganda, which is there. And I can run it forward like this. And you can see how South Korea is making a very, very fast advancement, whereas Brazil is much slower. And if we move back again here, and we put on trails on them like this, you can see again that the speed of development is very, very different. And the countries are moving more or less in the same rate as money and health. But it seems you can move much faster if you are healthy first than if you are wealthy first. And to show that, you can put on the way of United Arab Emirates. They came from here. A mineral country. They catch all the oil, they got all the money, but health cannot be bought at the supermarket. You have to invest in health. You have to get kids into schooling. You have to train health staff. You have to educate the population. And Sheikh Zayed did that in a fairly good way. And in spite of falling oil prices, he brought this country up here. So we got a much more mainstream appearance of the world, where all countries tend to use their money better than they used in the past. Now, this is more or less if you look at the average data of the countries. They are like this. Now, that's dangerous to use average data because there's such a lot of difference within countries. So if I go and look here, we can see that Uganda, that today is where South Korea was 1960. If I split Uganda, there's quite a difference within Uganda. These are the quintiles of Uganda. The richest 20% of Ugandans are there, the poorest are down there. If I split South Africa, it's like this. And if I go down and look at Nigeria, where there was such a terrible famine, lastly, it's like this. The 20% poorest of Nigeria is out here, and the 20% richest of South Africa is there, and yet we tend to discuss on what solutions there should be in Africa. Everything in this world exists in Africa. And you can't discuss universal access to HIV for that quintile up here with the same strategy as down here. The improvement of the world must be highly contextualized. And it's not relevant to have it on regional level. We must be much more detailed. We find that students get very excited when they can use this. And even more policymakers and the corporate sectors would like to see how the world is changing. Now, why doesn't this take place? Why are we not using the data we have? We have data in the United Nations, in the national statistical agencies, and in universities and other non-governmental organizations, because the data is hidden down in the databases. And the public is there, and the internet is there, but we have still not used it effectively. All that information we saw changing in the world does not include publicly funded statistics. There are some web pages like this, but they take some nourishment down from the databases, but people put prices on them, stupid passwords and boring statistics. And this won't work. So what is needed? We have the databases. It's not a new database you need. We have wonderful design tools, and more are added up here. So we started a non-profit venture, which we called Linking Data to Design. We call it Gapminder, from London Underground, where they warn you, mind the gap. So we thought Gapminder was appropriate. And we started to write software which could link the data like this. And it wasn't that difficult. It took some person years, and we have produced animations. You can take a data set and put it there. We are liberating UN data. Some few UN organizations, some countries accept that their databases can go out on the world. But what we really need is, of course, a search function. A search function where we can copy the data up to a searchable format and get it out in the world. And what do we hear when we go around? I've done anthropology on the main statistical units. Everyone says it's impossible. This can't be done. Our information is so peculiar and detailed, so that cannot be searched as other can be searched. We cannot give the data free to the students, free to the entrepreneurs of the world. But this is what we would like to see, isn't it? The publicly funded data is down here, and we would like flowers to grow out on the net. And one of the crucial points is to make them searchable, and then people can use the different design tool to animate it there. And I have a pretty good news for you. I have a good news that the present new head of UN Statistics, he doesn't say it's impossible. He only says we can't do it. And that's a quite clever guy. Huh? So we can see a lot happening in data in the coming years. We will be able to look at income distributions in completely new ways. This is the income distribution of China, 1970. This is the income distribution of the United States, 1970. Almost no overlap. Almost no overlap. And what has happened? What has happened is this, that China is growing, it's not so equal any longer, and it's appearing here, overlooking the United States, almost like a ghost, isn't it? Huh? It's pretty scary. But I think it's very important to have all this information. We need really to see it. And instead of looking at this, I would like to end up by showing the internet users per 1,000. In this software, we access about 500 variables from all the countries quite easily. It takes some time to change for this. But on the axes, you can quite easily get any variable you would like to have. And the thing would be to get up the databases free, to get them searchable, and with a second click to get them into the graphic formats where you can instantly understand them. Now the statisticians doesn't like it because they say that this will not show the reality. We have to have statistical analytical methods, but this is hypothesis generating. I end now with a world where the internet are coming, the number of internet users are going up like this. This is the GDP per capita, and it's a new technology coming in, but in amazingly how well it fits to the economy of the countries. That's why the $100 computer will be so important. But it's a nice tendency. It's as if the world is flattening off, isn't it? These countries are lifting more than the economy. And it will be very interesting to follow this over the year, as I would like you to be able to do with all the publicly funded data. Thank you very much.
It hasn't gotten old yet. Yeah. I don't remember what year this was from. Did it say at the beginning?
2006.
Oh, was it? I thought 2003,
Ghirardelli
but
chocolate
still pretty
chips.
close. It'd be interesting to see if their predictions were close.
Yeah. Just search for Hans Rawlings and see what has been updated since. Yeah, I love that. And it fits so well with this lecture.
I saw a nice one. I'll send it to you if I can find it. And it was a guy who was playing with data for, free data for different things. And he did something about bikes. And it was like a little bit shorter, but still really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So something like that can give you some ideas for displaying the data, especially if you're into, visualizing data. Could really enhance your presentations. And that kind of skill set would be super impressive when you go on job interviews. Because it helps. I mean, you see how he just told stories with that data? So cool. All right, so remember next week I'll be in Arizona. So you're going to record your case study and upload the recording, or send me a link to it.
Rest of the night. Yes, just Thursday.
Yeah, let's just say, by midnight Thursday. How about that? Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Bye, Marita. Jordan.
Thank you.
Yeah.